The Story of King Arthur and His Knights by Howard Pyle. Chapter 3rd. How King Arthur encountered 4 knights, and what befell thereby. Now the day was extraordinarily sweet and pleasant on one so lusty of frame and so lithe of heart as was good King Arthur. For the bright clouds swam smoothly across the blue sky in prodigious volumes of vapour, and the winds blew across the long grass of the meadowlands and across the fields of growing wheat, so that a multitude of waves travelled over the hills and valleys and were across an entire sea of green. And now all the earth would be darkened with wide shadows from these clouds, and anon everything would burst out of a sudden into a wonderful radiance of sunlight once more. And the little birds, they sang all gaily in the hedgerows and the leafy thickets as though they would burst their tiny throats with singing. And the cock crowed strong and lusty from the farm-croft. And all was so blithe and comely that the young king, with the visor of his helmet uplifted to the refreshment of the gentle breeze, would sometimes carol very joyously in his journeying. So travelled King Arthur in all that gay and tender summer season, when the earth was young and the time was of long gone by. Now, you are to remember that when King Arthur had come from Carlion unto the castle of Tintagilon, he had brought with him 4 young knights to bear him company. And those knights aforesaid were as follows. There was Sir Gawain, the son of King Lot and Queen Margase, and there was Sir Owain, the son of King Uriens and of Queen Morgana le Fay. And these 2 were nephews, half in blood, unto the king. And there was Sir Pereus, and there was Sir Geraint, the son of Urban. These were the 4 young noble knights who had come with King Arthur from Camelot unto Tintagilon. Now it befell, as King Arthur rode all gaily in the summer-time as aforesaid, that he came to a certain part of the road, where he beheld before him a tall and comely tower that stood upon a green hillock immediately by the roadside. And lo, there stood upon the balcony of that tower 3 fair damosels, clad all in green taffeta. And on the high road in front of the castle there was a knight clad all in very fine armour. And the knight sat upon a noble war-horse, and in his hands he held a lute, and he played upon the lute and sang in a voice of extraordinary sweetness. While he sang, those 3 ladies in green taffeta listened to him with a great cheerfulness of mind. And whenever that knight would stint his singing, then those 3 ladies would clap their hands together with a great acclaim, and would bid him to sing them again, and so he would do with a great readiness of spirit. All this King Arthur beheld, and it appeared to him to be a very pleasant sight, wherefore he rejoiced at it exceedingly. And as he drew nigh, lo, he beheld that the knight who had thus sat upon his horse and played upon the lute and sang unto the accompaniment thereof, was none other than Sir Geraint, the son of Urban. For that knight wore upon his crest the figure of a griffin, and the device upon his shield was 2 griffins rampant facing one another upon a field azure. And King Arthur knew that this was the crest and the devices of Sir Geraint. And when the king perceived who was the knight who sat there and sang, he laughed unto himself, and straightway closed his visor, and made him ready for such encounter as might perchance befall. So he drew nigh to where the knight sang, and the ladies listened. Now, when Sir Geraint perceived King Arthur approach, he ceased singing, and hung up his lute behind him across his shoulder. Then, casting upwards, he looked to those 3 fair ladies, and above him, quoth he, Mesdames, ye have been pleased to listen to the singing which I have essayed together in your honour. Now, likewise, in your honour, I will perform a deed of knightly prowess which I very much hope shall bring great glory to you. For, if you will be pleased to lend me that encouragement which your very great beauties can so easily afford, ye shall behold me, I doubt not, overthrow yonder knight completely, and that to your great credit and renown. Sir Knight, said the lady who spoke for the others, you are truly a lord of noble bearing and of exceeding pleasing of address. Wherefore we do wish you great success in this undertaking, and we do believe that you will succeed in that which you say to do. Upon these Sir Geraint gave those 3 damosels great thanks for their words, and thereupon he closed the visor of his helmet. So, dressing his spear and shield, and saluting those 3 ladies with great humility of demeanour, he went forth to meet King Arthur where he now sat at a little distance, very quietly and soberly awaiting his pleasure. Now Sir Geraint knew not King Arthur, because he wore no crest upon his helm and no device upon his shield. Wherefore, as he saluted, he made him speech to him in this wise. Ha, messire! I know not who thou art, seeing as thou bearest neither crest nor device. Nevertheless, I am minded to do with thee such honour as I may in running into tilt with thee upon behalf of these 3 damosels whom thou beholdest yonder upon that balcony. For I do affirm, and am ready to maintain the same with my knightly person, that those ladies are fairer than thy lady, whomsoever she may be. Sir knight, quoth King Arthur, I will gladly run a course with thee in honour of my lady. For, I may tell thee, she is a princess, and is held by many to be the most beautiful dame in all the world. But I will only contend with thee upon one condition, and the condition is this, that he who is overthrown shall yield himself as servant unto the other for 7 days, and in that time he will do all that may be required of him. I will accept thy gage, sir unknown knight, quoth Sir Geraint, and when I have overthrown thee, I will yield thee unto those fair ladies yonder for to be their servant for 7 days. And I do tell thee that there are a great many knights who would certainly regard that as being both a pleasant and honourable task. And, should I chance to overthrow thee, said King Arthur, I will send thee for to serve my lady for that same period of time. And that will be even a pleasanter and more honourable task than that which thou hast a mind for me to perform. So each knight saluted the other, and thereupon each took such a stand as should cast the encounter immediately beneath where those 3 fair damoiselles looked down from the balcony. Then each knight dressed his spear and his shield, and having made ready for the encounter, each sat for a small space entirely prepared. Then each shouted to his war horse, and drave spurs into its flank, and launched forth with a wonderful speed to the assault. So they met in the very midst of the course with a force so vehement that the noise thereof was wonderfully appalling for to hear. And each knight smote the other in the very centre of his defences. And lo, the spear of Sir Geraint burst into small pieces, even to the truncheon thereof. But the spear of King Arthur held, and Sir Geraint was cast so violently backward, that both he and his horse were overthrown into the dust, with a tumult like unto a monstrous roaring of thunder. And when Sir Geraint had recovered his footing, he was, for a while, so astonished that he wist not where he stood, for never he had been so overthrown in all his life before. Then, coming straightway unto himself again, he straightway drew forth his sword and called upon King Arthur with exceeding vehemence for to come down out of his saddle, and to fight him afoot. Nay, not so, Sir Knight, said King Arthur. I will not have to do with thee in that way. Moreover, thou art not to forget that thou hast promised to give thyself unto me as my servant for 7 days. For assuredly, I have entirely overcome thee in this encounter, and now thou art pledged unto me to be my servant. Then Sir Geraint knew not what to say, being altogether abashed with shame and vexation at his overthrow. Nevertheless, he perceived that he must uphold his knightly word unto that which he had pledged himself to do. Wherefore, he put up his sword again, though with exceeding discontent. Sir Knight, said he, I do acknowledge myself to have been overcome in this encounter. Wherefore, I yield myself now to thy commands, according to my plighted word. Then I do place my commands upon thee in this wise, quoth King Arthur. My command is, that thou go straightway unto the Lady Guinevere at Camelot, and that thou tellest her that thou hast been overthrown by that knight, to whom she gave her necklace as a token. Moreover, I do desire that thou shalt obey her in everything that she may command thee to do, and that for a space of 7 days to come. Sir Knight, quoth Sir Geraint, that which thou biddest me to do, I will perform according to thy commands. Thereupon he mounted his horse and went his way, and King Arthur went his way, and those 3 ladies who stood upon the balcony of the castle were exceeding glad that they beheld so noble an assay at arms that which they had looked down upon. Now, after King Arthur had travelled forwards, for the distance of 2 or 3 leagues or more, he came to a certain place of moorlands, where were many ditches of water, and where the heron and the marsh hen sought harbourage in the sedge. And here, at sundry points, were several windmills, with their sails turning slowly in the sunlight breeze before a wind which blew across the level plains of ooze. And at this place there was a long, straight causeway, with 2 long rows of pollard willows, one upon either hand. Now, when he had come nigh to the middle of this causeway, King Arthur perceived 2 knights, who sat their horses in the shade of a great windmill that stood upon one side of the roadway. And a large shadow of the sails moved ever and anon across the roadway as the wheel of the mill turned slowly before the wind. And all about the mill, and everywhere about, were great quantities of swallows that darted hither and thither like bees about a hive in midsummer. And King Arthur saw that those 2 knights, as they sat in the shadow of the mill, were eating a great loaf of rye bread, fresh baked and of brittle crust, and they ate fair white cheese, which things the miller, all white with dust, served to them. But when these two knights perceived King Arthur, they immediately ceased eating that bread and cheese, and straightway closed their helmets. As for the miller, when he saw them thus prepare themselves, he went quickly back into the mill and shut the door thereof, and then went and looked out of a window which was over above where the knights were standing. But King Arthur made very merry unto himself when he perceived that those two knights were Sir Gawain and Sir Owain. For he knew that one was Sir Gawain because the crest of his helmet was a leopard rampant, and because he bore upon his shield the device of a leopard rampant upon a field jewels. And he knew the other was Sir Owain because he bore upon his crest a unicorn, and because the device upon his shield was that of a lady holding a naked sword in her hand, which same was upon a field orb. Accordingly, while he was yet at some distance, King Arthur closed his helmet so these two young knights might not know who he was. So, when he had come near to the two knights, Sir Gawain rode forwards for a little distance for to meet him. Sir Knight, quoth he, thou must know that this is soothly perilous ground which upon thou hast ventured, for there is no byway hence across the morass, and thou mayst not go forward without trying a tilt with me. Sir Knight, said King Arthur, and I am very willing to run a tilt with thee. Nevertheless, I will only encounter thee upon one condition, and that is this, that he who is overthrown shall serve the other entirely for the space of 7 full days. I do accept thy gage, Sir Knight, quoth Sir Gawain, for he said unto himself, of assuredly, so exceedingly strong and skilful a knight as I shall easily encompass the overthrow of this unknown knight. So each knight immediately took his appointed station, and having dressed his spear and his shield, and having fully prepared himself in every manner, and having rested for a little space, each suddenly shouted to his horse, and drave spur into the flanks thereof, and so rushed to the encounter. And each knight smote the other in the midst of his defence, and lo, the spear of Sir Gawain burst into fragments, but the spear of King Arthur held, so that Sir Gawain was uplifted entirely out of his saddle and over the crupper of his horse. And indeed, he fell with wonderful violence into the dust, nor could he immediately rise from that fall, but lay all bedazzled for a little while. And when he did arise, he perceived that the white knight who had overthrown him sat nigh to him upon his horse. Then King Arthur spake and said, Sir Knight, I have altogether overthrown thee, and so thou must now serve me according to thy knightly word. Then spake up Sir Owain, who sat near by upon his horse. Not so, Sir Knight, he said, not so, nor until thou hast to do with me. For I do make demand of thee that thou shalt straightway joust with me. And, if I overthrow thee, I will claim of thee that thou shalt release my cousin from that servitude unto which he had pledged himself. But if thou overthrowest me, then I will serve thee even as he hath pledged himself to serve thee. Sir Knight, said King Arthur, I do accept thy gage with all the readiness of spirit. So each knight took his assigned place and dressed himself for the encounter. Then they shouted and drave together, rushing the one upon the other like two rams onto the hillside. And the spear of Sir Owain was also shivered in pieces. But King Arthur's spear held, so that the girths of Sir Owain's saddle were burst apart, and both the saddle and the knight were swept off the horse's back with such violence that a tower falling could not have made a greater noise than did Sir Owain when he smote the dust of that causeway. Then Sir Owain arose to his feet and gazed upon him, all filled with entire amazement. To him came King Arthur, and bespake him thus, Ha, Sir Knight, meseems that thou hast been fairly overcome this day. And so, according to your promise, both thou and yonder other knight must fulfill all my commands for the space of full 7 days to come. Now this is the command that I set upon ye, that ye shall straightway go unto the Lady Guinevere at Camelot, and shall take her greeting from her knight. And ye shall say that her knight unto whom she gave her necklace hath sent thee, who are king's sons, for to do obedience unto her. And all that she shall command ye to do in the space of these 7 days that are to come, that shall ye perform even unto the smallest grain. Sir Knight, said Sir Gawain, so we do according to thy commands, having pledged ourselves thereunto. But when these 7 days are past, I do make my vow that I shall seek thee out and shall carry this combat unto its entire extremity. For it may happen to be any knight to be unhorsed as I have been, yet I do believe that I may better success with thee, and I battle with thee to the extremity of my endeavour. Sir Knight, said King Arthur, it shall be even as thou desirest. Yet I do verily believe that when those 7 days are past, thou wilt not have a great desire for to fight with me as thou now hast. Having so spoken, King Arthur saluted those 2 knights, and they saluted him, and then he turned his horse and went his way. And whenever he bethought of how those 2 good knights had fallen before his assault, and when he thought of how astonished and abashed they had been at their overthrow, he laughed aloud with pure mirth, and vowed unto himself that he had never in all his life enjoyed so joyous an adventure as this. So when Sir Owain had mended the girths of his saddle, then he and Sir Gawain mounted their horses, and betook their way towards Camelot, much cast down in spirits. Then the miller came forth from the mill once more, greatly rejoiced at having beheld such a wonderfully knightly encounter from so safe a place as that from which he had beheld it. And so King Arthur rode onward with great content of mind until the slanting of the afternoon had come. And by that time he had come nigh that arm of the forest land which he had in mind as a proper place where he might leave his horse and his armor. Now, as he drew nigh to this part of the forest skirts, he perceived before him at the roadside a gnarled and stunted oak tree, and he perceived that upon the oak tree there hung a shield, and underneath the shield were written these words in fair large letters: "Whoso smiteth upon this shield doeth so at the peril of his body." Then King Arthur was filled with a great spirit, and, uplifting his spear, he smote upon that shield so it rang like thunder. Then immediately King Arthur heard a voice issue out of the forest, crying, "Who hath dared to assault my shield?" And straightway there came out thence a knight of large frame, riding about a horse white, like that which King Arthur himself rode. And the trappings of the horse and of the knight were all white, like unto the trappings of King Arthur and his horse. And the knight bore upon his helmet as his crest a swan with outspread wings, and upon his shield he bore the emblazonment of 3 swans upon a field argent. And because of the crest and the emblazonment of the shield, King Arthur knew that this knight was Sir Pellias, who had come with him from Camelot to Tintagel. So when Sir Pellias had come nigh to where King Arthur waited for him, he drew rein and bespake him with a great sternness of voice. "Ho, ho, Sir Knight," quoth he, "why didst thou dare to smite upon my shield? Verily that blow shall bring thee great peril and dole. Now prepare to defend thyself straightway because of what thou hast done." "Stay, stay, Sir Knight," said King Arthur. "It shall be as thou wouldst have it, and I will do combat with thee. Yet will I not essay this adventure until thou hast agreed that the knight who is overcome in this encounter shall serve the other in whatsoever manner that other might desire, for the space of 1 se'nnight from this time." "Sir Knight," said Sir Pellias, "I do accept that risk. Wherefore I bid thee now presently prepare thyself for the encounter." Thereupon each knight took his station and dressed his spear and shield. And when they had prepared themselves, they immediately launched together with violence like to 2 stones cast from a catapult. So they met in the midst of the course, and again King Arthur was entirely successful in that assault which he made, for the spear of Sir Pellias burst into pieces, and the spear of King Arthur held, and Sir Pellias was cast with a passing violence out of his saddle for the distance of more than half a spear's length behind the crupper of his horse. Nor did he altogether recover from that fall for a long time, so that King Arthur had to wait beside him for a considerable while ere he was able to lift himself up from the ground whereupon he lay. "Ha, ha, Sir Knight," said King Arthur, "assuredly it had not gone well for thee this day, for thou hast been entirely overthrown, and thou must straightway redeem thy pledge to serve me for 7 days thereafter. Wherefore I now set it upon thee as my command, that thou shalt go straightway unto Camelot, and that thou shalt greet the Lady Guinevere from me, telling her that her knight unto whom she gave her necklace hath been successful in battle with thee. Likewise I set upon thee that thou shalt obey her in the space of 7 days, whatsoever she may command thee to do." "Sir Knight," said Sir Pellias, "it shall even be as thou dost ordain. Yet I would that I knew who thou art, for I do declare that I have never yet in all my life been overthrown as thou hast overthrown me. And indeed, I think that there are very few men in this world who could serve me as thou hast served me." "Sir Knight," said King Arthur, "sometime thou shalt know who I am, but as of yet I am bound into entire secrecy." Thereupon he saluted Sir Pellias and turned and entered the forest and was gone. And Sir Pellias mounted his horse and betook him to Camelot, much cast down and disturbed in spirit, yet much marvelling who that knight could be who had served him as he had been served. So that night they came to Camelot, first Sir Geraint, then Sir Gawain and Sir Owain, and last of all there came Sir Pelleas. And when these four beheld one another, they were all abashed, so that one scarce dared to look at the other in the face. And when they came before the Lady Guinevere, and made their condition known to her, and told her how the knight who wore her necklace had overthrown them all, and had sent them thither to serve her for a Sir Knight, and when she reckoned how great and famous were those four knights in deeds of chivalry, she was exceedingly exalted that a knight should have approved himself so great in those deeds of arms, which he had undertaken to perform. But she greatly marvelled who that champion could be, and debated those things in her own mind. For it was a thing altogether unheard of that one knight, in one day, and with a single spear, should have overthrown 5 such well-proved and famous knights as Duke Mordaunt of Northumbria, Sir Geraint, Sir Gawain, Sir Owain, and Sir Pelleas. So she gave herself great joy that she had bestowed the gift of her necklace upon so worthy a knight, and she was exceedingly uplifted with extraordinary pleasure at the thought of the credit he had endowed her withal. Now after King Arthur had entered the forest, he came by and by to where those wood-choppers, afore spoken of, plied their craft. And he abided with them for the night, and when the next morning had come, he entrusted them with his horse and armour, charging them to guard those things with all care, and that they should be wonderfully rewarded therefor. And he took his departure from that place with intent to return unto Camelot, and he was clad in that jerkin of frieze which he had worn since he had left Pentecoelum. And while he had reached the outskirts of the forest, he set his cap of disguise upon his head, and resumed his mean appearance once more. So his nakedness being entirely hidden, he returned to Camelot for to be the gardener's boy as he had been before.